Where are you?
When Evelyn first saw the doll, it was on the highest shelf of Wren's Curiosities, an old shop in her small town. The doll had pale porcelain skin, large glassy eyes, and golden curls. Its lips were painted red, shaped into a tiny smile. A rare piece, the shopkeeper said in a rough voice, made by the old doll maker. People say his dolls are cursed. He laughed, but his eyes looked serious. Evelyn loved collecting vintage dolls, and this one was too special to leave behind. She bought it and placed it in a glass cabinet in her bedroom. That night, Evelyn woke up to a soft tapping sound. 3 gentle knocks. Her heart raced as she sat up in bed. The sound came from the cabinet. The doll had moved. It was no longer sitting upright. Its hands, which had rested in its lap, were now against the glass. Maybe an earthquake, Evelyn whispered, but everything was still. The next day, she put the doll back in its place. By night, she had convinced herself it was just her imagination, but the tapping came again, night after night. Each time, the doll was closer to the cabinet door. One morning, Evelyn woke up to find the cabinet open. The doll was on her nightstand. Its smile seemed wider. A shiver ran down her spine. "I must be sleepwalking," she said. But her dreams were full of distant laughter, a child's voice calling her name. Her best friend Clara noticed Evelyn's tired face. "You look awful," Clara said, "still playing with your creepy dolls." "This one is different," Evelyn whispered. "It moves." Clara laughed. "You sound crazy." That night, Evelyn locked the doll in the attic. She wrapped it in cloth and stuffed it in an old chest. Finally, the tapping stopped. For a week, the house was quiet. Evelyn slept peacefully until the whispering began. At first, it was fainter, breathy sound behind the attic door. Then it grew louder, closer. "Let me out," the voice said. Evelyn refused to open the attic. She stuffed towels under the door. She left lights on, but the voice followed her. "Let me out," it begged. One night, Clara stayed over. "It's just stress," she said, as they drank wine. A loud bang echoed through the house. They froze. The attic door was open. Clara's face turned, pale. "What was that?" "The doll," Evelyn whispered. They climbed the attic stairs together. The air felt heavy. The chest was open and empty. A child's giggle echoed behind them. They turned. The doll sat on the top step, its head tilted to one side. But something was different. Its glass eyes were no longer blank. They seemed angry. Evelyn grabbed the doll and ran to the fireplace. "I'm ending this," she said, throwing it into the flames. The porcelain cracked as the fire burned. A sharp, ghostly scream filled the room. Then, silence. Relief washed over her. It was finally over, or so she thought. Days later, Evelyn returned to Wren's Curiosities to ask the shopkeeper about the doll, but the store was gone. In its place was an empty lot. "You burned it," Clara said. "It's over." But Evelyn wasn't sure. That night, as she fell asleep, she heard a familiar sound. Tap, tap, tap. When she opened her eyes, the doll was back on her nightstand. Its burned lips stretched into a terrifying smile. Evelyn's life became a nightmare. The doll followed her everywhere, in her kitchen, her car, even her bed. No matter how many times she destroyed it, it always returned. Desperate. Evelyn sought help from Mrs. Hensley, a local expert on strange objects. The old woman studied the doll with a worried face. "The doll maker was more than an artist," she said. "He trapped lost spirits in his dolls. Some of those spirits are not kind. How do I stop it?" Evelyn asked, her voice shaking. Mrs. Hensley handed her an old book. "You must return the doll to where it was made, the doll maker's workshop. Burn it there, and the curse may break." The workshop was deep in the woods outside town. It was old and falling apart. Under a full moon, Evelyn and Clara carried the doll, wrapped in salt-soaked cloth, to the ruins. The air grew cold as they entered. Shadows seemed to move around them. At the center was a stone fireplace, covered in dust. Evelyn placed the doll inside and lit the fire. The doll's mouth opened wide in a silent scream. The walls shook. Ghostly figures of children appeared, watching with hollow eyes. A final ear-piercing shriek filled the air as the doll crumbled to ash. The house fell quiet. The heavy feeling was gone. Evelyn and Clara left, shaking but relieved. For the first time in weeks, Evelyn slept peacefully. The tapping and whispers were gone. But sometimes, late at night, she still hears distant laughter, proof that the doll-maker's curse was never really broken.
Where are you?
Sophie had always loved collecting old dolls. Each one felt like a piece of history, a forgotten treasure with its own mysterious past. One rainy afternoon, while exploring a dusty flea market, she found a small porcelain doll lying in a cracked wooden box. Its face was pale, with black glass eyes that seemed to lifelike. The doll wore a faded blue dress, and its tiny hands were delicately carved, as if it had been crafted with care. A crumpled, yellowed note was tucked inside the box. "Do not place me near a mirror." Sophie chuckled softly. "How creepy," she muttered, showing the note to the old seller. The seller shrugged. "People say it's cursed," he said, "but that's just a story. If you like it, it's yours half price." Sophie didn't believe in curses. She loved a good bargain and took the doll home, placing it on her bedroom shelf, right next to her antique mirror. That night, as Sophie brushed her hair, she noticed something strange. In the mirror's reflection, the doll wasn't facing forward. Instead, it seemed to be turned toward her, even though the real doll was facing away. She shook her head and laughed. "I'm just tired," she told herself, and switched off the light. But the next morning, the doll had moved. It was no longer on the shelf. Instead, it was sitting directly in front of the mirror, its small porcelain hands resting neatly in its lap. Sophie frowned. "I didn't put you there." She returned the doll to the shelf and left for work. But when she came home, the doll was back by the mirror. It was as if it refused to be anywhere else. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The room felt colder than usual. In the middle of the night, she woke to a faint scratching sound. Her heart pounded as she turned on the bedside lamp. The doll was on her nightstand. Its glass eyes seemed to glint in the shadows, and its head tilted slightly to the side, as if it were watching her, terrified. Sophie grabbed the doll, stuffed it into a cupboard, and shoved it deep under her bed. But the scratching grew louder. At midnight, a loud crash jolted her awake. Her mirror lay shattered on the floor. In the middle of the broken glass sat the doll, its painted smile wider than before. The next morning, Sophie called her best friend Jenna. "It's just an old doll," Jenna said, rolling her eyes when she arrived. "You're letting your imagination run wild. I'll stay the night if it makes you feel better." That evening, as the two friends settled in to watch a movie, the room grew colder again. The lights flickered briefly, but Jenna brushed it off. "Old wiring," she said. But when the clock struck midnight, the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway. "Did you hear that?" Sophie whispered, her voice shaking. Jenna nodded, her face pale. The footsteps grew closer. When they turned on the light, the doll was standing upright. Its hand was pressed against the frame of a new mirror Sophie had hung on the wall. "We have to get rid of it," Jenna whispered. Sophie didn't argue. She wrapped the doll in a thick cloth, making sure not to look into its eyes, and drove with Jenna to an abandoned well on the edge of town. The wind howled as Sophie dropped the doll into the dark water below. They waited until the echo of the splash faded before driving away, both feeling a strange sense of relief. For a few days, everything seemed normal. The strange noises stopped. Sophie finally began to sleep through the night. The mirror was replaced, and life moved on. But 1 week later, Sophie woke to a chill in the air. Her breath misted in front of her face. Slowly, she turned her head toward the mirror. The doll's reflection was there, its black eyes gleaming. But there was no doll on the shelf. Her blood ran cold as she noticed something else. In the mirror's corner, a shadowy figure stood. Behind her, long thin fingers reached toward her shoulder. A whisper echoed in her ears. "I never left."